Okay. Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for joining our webinar on Monte Carlo Simulations, Making Sense of Uncertainty. We're going to introduce ourselves here in just a minute, but I actually want to go ahead and start a little poll. I'm going to start that now, and it's going to be, have you used Monte Carlo Simulations for forecasting? Yes, I have. Not yet, or I really don't know. So those are all valid answers. So as we wait for people to pop in, go ahead and let us know about your experience. Also, if you've already voted in the poll, I just want to make you aware that we have a chat where you can chat with everyone else in the webinar, get a little community vibe going on. And we also have a dedicated Q&A panel. So while you can ask questions in chat, they might easily get lost. So if you have questions that you would like us to answer in the webinar, you'll have a better chance of us getting to those if you put those in the Q&A area. And Dan and I will, we want to spend most of today's time talking about your questions and the things that you want. And we've got a couple of moderators to help us do that. So, okay, I am going to end the poll here and showing the results. So we have about, let's say 61% of people, a little over the median point there, that have experienced Monte Carlo simulations before, 38% that haven't, and a couple of people that are not sure because maybe they're not the ones running the simulations, or they're using a tool but they haven't been told what's running behind it to help them get the answers. So thanks for participating in that. Okay. Now, hopefully everyone can see my screen here with the webinar slides, and these slides will be made available for you later. But we're going to dive into today's topic. We're going to do just a really basic overview of Monte Carlo simulations so that those of you who have never heard of it before can have a basic understanding of what we're talking about. And then we're going to dive into some user questions. So I really suggest if you have questions, go ahead and start throwing them in the Q&A channel so that they're there when we get to them. We do have some questions that have been brought to us before, so we can start with those. But it's always good to have the questions for the people who are actually on the call. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. So I want to introduce myself. I'm Julia Wester. I am the co-CEO and co-founder of 55 Degrees, and we're the software company who delivers and creates actionable agile analytics in Jira, Azure, and standalone. Also Portfolio Forecaster, which is another app that works with Monte Carlo forecasting, as well as some other things. And we're hosting this webinar today, and we're really, really glad to have Daniel Vacanti with us. Dan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell them all the goodies.
Thanks, Julia. In 25 words or less. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name's Daniel Vacanti. I was the original founder of Actionable Agile. I had the great pleasure to partner with Julia several years ago, and it's been a wonderful experience ever since on the Actionable Agile stuff. Written several books on this metrics topic, three books, which maybe if Julia reminds me, we'll talk about a little bit later. But if I had to describe my day-to-day job in one sentence, it would be, as I always say, be just to do whatever Julia tells me.
I don't think so. He's also the co-founder of ProKanban.org. And again, it's something I'm going to have to remind him. He's bad at promoting himself. He has a consulting and training practice that he's going to talk to you about at the end. So while my company focuses a lot on delivering you tools to use this and supporting you in those tools, when it comes to consulting and training, we're going to hand it off to people like Dan, primarily Dan to start with, unless he's full and says, no, go elsewhere. Because, that's a nice partnership, and we don't always have the capacity to act in that sort of role. So it's a nice little partnership here, and that's why we're talking. So let's dig into it. Monte Carlo simulation basics. So there's a lot of words. I'm just going to slowly walk through it. I've highlighted and underlined the key ones there. So when you use a Monte Carlo simulation, it's going to be in environments where uncertainty and variability exist. So that means there's a range of possible outcomes that could happen, and we want to understand the likelihood of each outcome because we're in complex environments, and our traditional ways of just using our brain to think through the possibilities doesn't get us those answers. So we need to use this computational technique called a Monte Carlo simulation. We're going to be showing you a bit of what that is. But when we're talking for the purposes of software development forecasting, because Monte Carlos are used in lots of places. They're used in your investment portfolio prospectus. They're, I think, used to think about risk for insurance companies when they're doing their whatever that stuff is called that you do. I know some of you work at insurance companies, so you know what I'm talking about. But anywhere where there's uncertainty and variability, this is a really great tool, and software development is definitely one of those places. So when we're talking about it, though, we're talking about two general questions, all related to when something is going to be done. So say fixed scope. I've got this amount of work. How long will it take me to get that done? Or how much can we finish? So I've got a fixed date, and I just need to know how much stuff we can get out by that date. So those are the two common questions that we're answering. And again, if you're working with people in traditional product or project management, fixed scope and fixed dates are really, terms that are used quite a lot. So that's how I like to correlate those with these two questions. So how do we answer those questions? So we are going to use data. So as you work through your process, and if you're using an electronic tool like Jira or Azure DevOps or something like that, every time you move your item through a workflow, and especially when you complete it, there's data generated. And so we can tell when those kinds of things happened. So when we look at how many items you finish in a given day, in a given week, etc., that data over time becomes a really great model of what happens in your context. So your data is your model of how much you can get done with all the crap that's coming at you all the time. It's a model that incorporates all of your situation. Okay, so using that model and having this simulation run thousands and thousands of randomized trials, then we can start looking at the outcomes, building a little histogram that we'll show you in a little bit, and we can see which outcomes happen. So that's spectrum of possible results. And then we can also start to see which ones are more likely than others. Okay, and so think about what you would be able to do if you know that information. What could possibly happen? Which ones are more likely? Which ones are less likely? That helps you think about how much risk you're willing to accept. You're making decisions that are based on more than a gut feel or a particular expert's opinion. And not only can you plan for that single future you want to happen, you know which alternate versions of the future you might need to consider as well. So this is a really, really important tool to help us embrace the complexity instead of trying to hide it under the rug, right? We can make it work for us. So that's how it works. Now, to do this, you need a bit of information. Of course, you need to know the fixed scope or the fixed date that you want to work with. But you also need a little bit of good data. So the data that we need, again, is something called throughput. That's one of the 4 core flow metrics. And it's simply the number of items that go into the finished, part of your workflow, whatever you call it, whatever that means to you. It's crossed the finish line. It's done for your purposes. And so we just need to know how many of those items happen per unit of time, per day, per week, whatever. In our examples, we're going to be using per day, throughput per day. So this is an example of a chart that shows days, and you can see you've got quite a bit of variation on how many items might be finished in a day. And this is a model that I would feed into that simulation, and it would start running all of those trials. Now, what does good mean? We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about this. This will come out in the questions. This is what the questions are mostly going to be about. But first of all, it has to be accurate. So if you come to me and you say, well, we forget to move our cards, so at the end of the week, we push them over. I'm like, well, okay, I can only, if we're using your data to really be able to figure out what's possible in complexity, which requires you to use your data. Actually, it's not just something we want to do. You sort of have to. Then, garbage in, garbage out. I can give you a very inaccurate forecast if I get inaccurate data. So the more accurate your data, the more accurate your forecast. Of course, you don't need to necessarily worry about down to the second. That's, there's a balance there. Representative, right? That means that the data that I'm using was generated in the same kind of conditions as the conditions I'm going to have for the time I'm trying to forecast. So if I'm using data, and actually we're going to talk about one of my situations, unless we've got some great customer questions, and you'll probably have this too. But say you come out of summertime and you're in Europe, right? So everyone's out in August. And I'm trying to forecast for September. Well, do I use August's data? Well, no, because nothing really got done. So, you have to think about which data is representative for the conditions and the time you're trying to forecast. And again, it's an art, not an exact science. And then stable, and this is something I'll talk about less right here. We might get into more of the questions, but focusing on sort of a more stable, predictable flow will always not only give you better forecasts in these situations, but solve many other problems that you're experiencing as well. So working on smoothing out your controllable variation is good, but you don't need to have a flat line here in your data. So those are some basics that I wanted to talk about. And get everyone sort of on the same page. I want to see if there's any questions now. While I look at the questions, Dan, is there anything that you want to add to this definition and basics of Monte Carlo forecasting?
I mean, I think you've covered it all. I mean, it's because as I was looking through, I was reading the questions as you were talking. Yeah. And I think we are going to need to talk about this concept of risk a lot, because for me, Monte Carlo is one of the best risk mitigation strategies out there. And it's funny to read some of these questions where it sounds like some managers see Monte Carlo as more risky than less risky. And that really boggles my mind. I kind of want to dig into those a little bit more.
Let's talk about that. Because, that makes me think about Julie Starling, who I met through her company using Actionable Agile. And since I've learned way more from her than she's learned from me. And she has done this great talk now many times on, and the thing that I take away from that, the thing that sticks in my mind after her talks is that you only think you have certainty when you're using these other methods, when you've got the one answer and it's not so complex with all the possibilities and the probabilities and all of that. That feels so uncertain and unfluid. But you actually don't have the certainty that you think you do. So you're sort of hiding under the covers a little bit. So she talks about the matrix. You can take the blue pill or the red pill. You can keep hiding in the matrix and living your day like, everything's normal, or you can take, the pill that opens your eyes and sees certainty was never there. Let me go figure out how to work in this not new environment, but new to our realization of what reality really is. And that's something I think we have to keep reminding ourselves Oh, yeah, we never had that certainty. That was never certain. I don't know. What do you think about that, Dan?
Should we get into
Yeah.
addressing some of these kind of?
Yes, let's do. I'll find that question.
Head on. Well, I'm looking at one from Randy right
Yeah.
now. It says, how do you deal with a senior manager who wants to focus on getting the teams to improve their estimating abilities, and thinks that Monte Carlo is just hocus pocus? As you can tell, I'm kind of speechless when I hear a question like that. My semi-facetious, semi-serious answer to that is, I would find that manager's manager and get this manager fired. Like I said, there's kind of a grain of truth to that, because anybody who believes that estimating is better than Monte Carlo. I mean, so an estimation, in my mind anyway, an estimation is really just a guess. But as Julie was talking about, Monte Carlo simulations have been applied in all kinds of industries. I mean, it was used to develop the first atomic bomb. It's used to forecast, hurricanes right now. We're talking literally life and death situations. And can you imagine a meteorologist who is trying to forecast where a hurricane is going to go, and their boss coming to them and say, forget about all that Monte Carlo nonsense. Just tell me what your best guess is at where the hurricane's going to go. I mean, I can't imagine a conversation like that happening in a even semi quasi serious scenario. That's how I'd flip the script, is just exactly like what Julia was saying, is, estimating is somebody's best guess, and there's no way with an estimation. I shouldn't say there's no way. It's next to impossible with most estimation techniques to assess a level of risk associated with that estimation. The whole point of the Monte Carlo is you're quantifying the risk associated with those certain outcomes. Uncertainty is a fact of life, as Julie Starling was saying. Uncertainty is a fact of life. You can't run away from it. It's there, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. It is intrinsic to what we do, and so we need something like a Monte Carlo simulation to be able to quantify that risk to make better business decisions.
Yeah.
Not that I'm triggered by questions like this, Julia.
Well, I have a different, I don't necessarily disagree with Dan. I have a different tact that you could take if, you want to save that one for your back pocket. You can choose between which ones of these will work better for you. So I think a lot of times when something doesn't work, like estimation, we're just going to pick on that one for right now. So I've done a lot of talks about this where there's the 3 knowledge gaps, Stephen Bungay. So, I'm not even going to try to remember all of those, but basically we're doing this whole agile thing because we agree that we can't know everything up front, right? Yet we continue to try to insert techniques into that process that explicitly accepts uncertainty. And so we continue to force in these processes that want us to be more certain too early. And so what happens is when they don't work, then we double down and do it harder. We try to build a better estimation model. We try to spend more time on it, get more expensive salaried people to come in, the experts, and spend their time and make those better estimates. It's extremely expensive. So my just very pragmatic answer to this question would be, is if you can get answers that are as accurate or better, cheaper than it takes you to get better estimates, then why aren't you doing that instead? What is the connection? Is it a more emotional attachment to that estimation activity? Or is it a really practical business-minded decision? Because if you look at the money you're spending on one approach versus another, and you just compare the cost versus the benefit, I think you'll get the right answer for your group, right? And there's also no problem with doing them side by side to see which ones give you a better result and cost you less. So that might be an experiment worth doing. That's a great question. Let's see. What are some other questions? So I see one that Margot asked on behalf of a customer. So we have dynamic teams. Does a simulation count for my colleagues moving back and forth between teams? Dan, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so if everybody was listening to Julia at the start, and I was certainly listening to Julia, and shame on you if you weren't listening to Julia, but remember she talked about that the basic assumption, the fundamental assumption that Monte Carlo is making is that the future that you're trying to predict roughly looks like the past that you have data for. So if you have dynamic teams where people are constantly swapping in and swapping out and swapping in and swapping out, if that is your context, I mean, if that's what happens every day, every week, or whatever, and you expect that context to continue, into the future, at least certainly for the duration of the forecast, then the historical throughput that you were going to feed into your Monte Carlo simulation will reflect that. It will reflect the fact that we are constantly swapping people in and swapping out. And so believe it or not, I mean, as long as those conditions are met, believe it or not, you can still use that historical data for, to do the forecasting in your Monte Carlo simulation. Where I guess you have to be careful is in this situation of when it comes to system stability that Julia was mentioning earlier. So, like I said, if it's fairly if it's fairly constant that's your context for swapping people's in and out all the time, then your past will look like your future. If it's this kind of like random thing where, like, I don't know, every 3 months or so we're adding 5 people to a team, or we're taking 5 people to a team, if that's not necessarily your context and it's more the exception rather than the rule, well, then you're essentially destabilizing your system, and you have to be much, much more careful about, can you use that historical data for, to do the forecasting. So then we get into deeper philosophical questions like organizational design and things like that, and why are we swapping people in and out, which we don't have time for today. But just know, short answer, if that is what's happening in your group in your teams, then there's potentially no reason why you can't use that historical data to do forecasting.
Yeah, so I just brought up Monte Carlo in action so that we could use that as we discuss some of these scenarios. And so sort of one thing Dan was saying is that if this data pattern, which is your model, this is your capabilities in the face of everything that's happened to you, changing teams, getting interrupted, changing priorities, all of that. So if that pattern has been happening all throughout this process, then all of this data is probably still relevant. But if it doesn't happen very often, and then maybe you say, hey, we just changed teams here, we might just want to use that new data from that point onwards. Or we might say there might be a reason where you want to use an older piece of your data. And this is where it becomes more of an art than a science, because you have to think about what things happened. And then you have to see which collection of things happening is most like what I'm going to experience. And then you grab that set of data. So that's also a hypothesis. You think you're going to experience that, right? So when I talked to Heidi Helfand, who wrote Dynamic Reteaming, I asked her this question because I'm like, you totally are a proponent of dynamic reteaming, and you're a huge proponent of this type of forecasting. How do those two go together? And she said, well, I really don't worry about it, because when my teams get together, they just have to finish 10 things, and then I have enough data to start going again. So sometimes I think we make this a bigger problem than it really is. We try to worry about being too explicitly precise. And while we do want to be accurate, sometimes we think if you can't be 100% accurate, then it's not useful. That's not really the truth. And you can never be 100% accurate. You'll notice that none of the probabilities ever go above 99%. And I think 99% is, if you're trying to get that high, then you're just faking accepting uncertainty because then you're just including every possibility of something that could happen to you. So you really should think about the risk that you're willing to accept and stuff like that. So hopefully that helped. Let's see. Let's see what questions that we have.
So are the circles with numbers, are those votes? Are people voting?
So, yep. So
should we be ordering by?
Yes. So I was looking at that. So we have one here that's been voted pretty highly from Stuart. One thing I've never been able to understand, if the data in the model, if the data going into the model is throughput of work items, so these are post breakdown, right? Story task level. How do we forecast when we haven't yet broken down the work to the similar level of detail? So let's dig into that, Dan.
You want me to go first? Yeah. Okay. Another basic assumption of Monte Carlo that we really haven't talked about is, especially if we're talking about in Stuart's case here, let's say we're doing a Monte Carlo, how many? We want to know, in a given time period, how many items can we get done? When your Monte Carlo spits out an answer, says, hey, you have a 70% chance of getting, 20 or more items done in the next time period. What Monte Carlo is not telling you, without a doubt, what Monte Carlo is not telling you is which of those, what 20 items are going to get done. So even when we're trying to try to do a Monte Carlo, when, I've got 50 items in my backlog. And so the question might be, well, so I know I want to do these 50 items in my backlog. And then so Stuart comes along and says, but we haven't refined these 50 items. We could talk about the term refinement here in a second if we want to, or not, which would be okay too. But I don't know. I've got these 50 items in my backlog. I haven't broken them down. So I don't know really how many those are. Believe it or not, that's not a problem. Because again, getting back to what Julia just said, when you have 50 items in your backlog and you say, we need to know when these 50 items are going to get done, you are assuming that the functionality that those 50 items represent with 100% certainty must get done. And generally speaking, when you have 50 items in your backlog and people say we need to get all those 50 items done, you don't need to get all 50 items done. Even if those 50 items explode into 150 items, you don't need to get all of those things done. And the beauty of the Monte Carlo simulation will tell us is, hey, if we're trying to forecast for the next month or, or the next quarter or whatever, the Monte Carlo will come back and it will tell you, here is your budget. Like I have a budget of 35 things. I'm going to make this up. I have a budget of 35 things. Now it becomes a question of, okay, which of these broken down 35 things should we be working on? So a lot of people get wrapped around this axle of, well, what if I haven't broken down items in my backlog, and should I account for split rate? Again, don't get me started on split rate. Should I account for things like split rate and things like that? And more often than not, the answer is no, you don't need to know that, because the Monte Carlo it's giving you your budget. It's giving you essentially your capacity of how much your system can handle. And then in a much more just-in-time manner, should you be selecting those items in terms of what's really going to fit that customer need. So I hope that makes sense.
Can I sort of recap that to make sure that I and everyone else sort of understood it correctly? So when we're running the Monte Carlo forecast, we're not actually trying to forecast those unbroken down items. We're trying to say how many, eventual stories or that type of broken down thing, to use the terminology, are we going to be able to complete in a given time? Or when will we get all of these things done, right? And so that information, which is more knowable, arms you that as you break down all of those things, you know that you can get X amount of things done. So it helps you know that, okay, I need to pull the most important X number of those things and get them through the system, right? So it like you said, it gives you your budget Like the money in your checking account, when it's out, right? It's going to run out by that date. So regardless of what you have in your backlog, make sure that that amount of items, it was the most important ones to accomplish. Does that encapsulate it right? Okay, cool. It's actually a way I know this, but that was said in a way that was actually very helpful to me. I hadn't thought of it in quite that way before. I know another thing that people get confused about is that when you're thinking about 10 items in your backlog, so if I'm in this is a Monte Carlo win, and I say I have 10 items I want to complete, and I'm thinking of 10 specific items, this doesn't know about your items. It doesn't even care about your items. It just says that if I start today, when can I get 10 items across the finish line? And that means the next 10. That could be things that you've already started. It could be things that you haven't started. It's just saying that 10 things will cross the finish line in that period of time, not 10 unstarted things that you're deciding are important. So I think that was also something that was a bit of an eye-opener for me as well. Great. Let's see. We've got a lot of, I love this voting thing because we can see what questions are really speaking to people. I see a question about dry data and wet data. And Dan, does that mean something to you?
Well, I mean, I saw that too. I would want a little bit more context in terms of what do you mean by dry data and wet data? Yeah.
So Ben, if you can give us a little more information, we'll come back to that. Let's go to another question from Alex. What do you recommend as the optimum length of data to base calculations on? Alex tends to look at the last 3 months. What do you use?
Yeah. So again, this gets back to it has much less and almost nothing to do with the amount of time that you're looking at, and has much more to do. Again, getting back to Julia. By the way, if anybody listened to Julia's lead-in, she's answered all of these questions. She pretty much.
But the devil's in the details, Dan.
Yeah.
You can know information, but then when you go to use it, it means nothing. So everything's in the details.
Yeah. So it has much less to do with the amount of time and has much more to do with the quote unquote quality of the data. So remember, we're saying all we want to know is this past that we have data for. Do we expect the future to look like that past? And as Julia also mentioned, kind of generally speaking, from roughly speaking, statistically, we can get into the statistics of this too. I keep saying that we might need a whole new webinar on all the topics that Dan said, hey, we'll get into that, but we'll need to do that later. Roughly speaking, if you're somewhere around 10 data points, 10 good data points, that's pretty much all you need to start going with a Monte Carlo simulation. You know, more data is not necessarily better. Because at some point that more data is going to cross that threshold of, okay, not being reflective of what we're trying to project in the future. So for me, it's more about choosing that. And this is where it's much more art than science. This is why we're talking to smart people like you, right? It's more about selecting the data from your past, the amount of data points from your past that is going to look like that future. In North America, you would never use, kind of to extend Julia's metaphor here, in North America, you would never use December data to forecast January. Even though that's within that 3-month time period, you just wouldn't do it because December doesn't look like January. It gets a little bit more difficult in North America because they're like, okay, well, then we'll look at November. Well, November doesn't necessarily, it might look like January. It's maybe closer. So now do we go back to October? Do we go back to last January? Do we? And so this is just where you'll need to, need to, like I said, kind of engage your brain, engage your common sense, and come up and say, okay, what of that historical data looks like the future that I'm trying to project?
Yeah, and I wanted to share an example. So this is another way that a more complex Monte Carlo simulation can look. And so what this is it's doing the same kind of Monte Carlo simulations in the background. It's just what I'm putting into it is a little bit different. I'm telling it, hey, I've got these, whereas the Monte Carlo simulations in Actionable Agile are very generic, they don't care about what work is going in. I'm in this app Portfolio Forecaster. I'm able to say, okay, these are sort of my parent collection, my efforts that have work still left to be done inside of them. So you see I have translations. That's got 2 items of work. Yeah, I've got create an admin console. That's got 4 left. And I know that all of these items are going on at the same time. So really, this is 8 items I've got to do. I'm trying to figure out not only when will all of them be done, but can I figure out when each one will be done sort of separately? So it's a bit of an Uber Monte Carlo simulation. And you see we have the same kind of throughput data that we're using as our, to tell it how fast we get work done. And when I had this same situation, when we use Portfolio Forecaster to forecast actionable agile development, to forecast Portfolio Forecaster development. And so we came out of the summer. We're in Europe, we're in Sweden. And so, by default, we pull 90 days because got to start somewhere. Anyone can override that, but 90 days, why not, right? But I was like, oh, that doesn't look right. That doesn't pass my sniff test, right? And so then I had to go back and look at my data, and I really did have to sit down and go, wow, should I just pull the last 14 days, 30 days? I was into September. How did I want to do that? And I think that's what I did. I decided to pull the last 30 days. And as I start finishing more work, that 30 days becomes more and more relevant. I can go back and get to a bit of a wider data set if I want to. But the point is just as long as you know how your situation is changing, you can adjust the data that you're using to make sure that it's always reflective. So yeah, it's really an art based on a little bit of science, right? So, there was one thing too here. I like to talk about when you're sort of in Actionable Agile, when you're playing around with Monte Carlos to scenario plan for different kinds of risk. I think about it this way. Risk manifests in either additional work or a change in our capability to finish work, our capacity, right? Our throughput. So we do have these simulation controls here. So if you're thinking, hey, I could have anywhere between 10 and 20 items I need to do. I can put a range there. And then it can do a bit of variation on the amount of work as well. And I could do this in combination, but I can say, hey, we have a situation coming up, a risk that could manifest, and I think that would reduce our capacity by 20%. So I can scale my throughput down to 20% to 0.8 instead of 1. And then I'm able to sort of see if that risk manifests and that reduction actually happens, how would that impact my forecast? So not only can you use Monte Carlo simulations to use your actual data as is to generate actual forecasts, you can use the mechanisms to play a bit of scenario planning. You have to make a hypothesis of the risks that could happen, the impact of those risks, and then you can input data changes to see how your forecast would change. My strong suggestion would be, once you do that, go back to using your real data and track what's actually happening with your data, because your scenario is just a hypothesis. Your data is the real thing. So you need to go back to your real data and see if your hypothesis is panning out. But it's always good to play around and see if these big risks manifest, what are the boundaries of these things that could happen as well. So you do have levers and things to pull. I think it's good to know when you're scenario planning versus when you're looking at your actual data generated real forecast with a 1.0 throughput, and the actual amount known to you right now. Do you agree with that, Dan? Do you have any other thoughts about that?
No, I think you've nailed it. I think that's great. I mean,
cool.
I was looking through the next questions. I'm excited to get to some of these other questions.
Yeah,
These are really, really good questions.
Pick pick one, Dan, and then we can, if there are some that we don't get to, we can use these for content creation and still answer questions, even if we don't get to all of them in the time allotted.
Yeah, there are a couple questions about how do we forecast a project when we don't have any historical data?
Yep.
Maybe this is a new team coming together. Maybe this is work that we've never done before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so bottom line, if you don't have any data, you can use pretty much any estimation technique you want. They will all be equally bad. So my question is, when somebody comes to me and says we don't have data, my question always is that really the case? Is that really true? Because maybe in the case of a brand new team, maybe the work that they're working on is looks like maybe a project that you've done in the past with a different team, and maybe you can use that team's data. If this really is brand new work that we've never done before, well, but it's the same team doing that work, maybe we can use their throughput from a different project. You've got a whole bunch of levers to pull. The book that I always love to refer people to on this is How to Measure Anything with Douglas Hubbard. And he talks about techniques that you can use when you think that you don't have data. There are certainly techniques that you can use to at least get that initial forecast. But and for me, the big but is it is never, I almost never say never, right? But I think I can say never here. It is never the case that you ever only produce one forecast. Especially I guess you might produce one forecast and then decide not to do it. I guess, okay, that's fair. But if you're actually doing the work, you never just do one forecast. So just because we put forth a forecast at the beginning when we had limited to no data, doesn't mean the forecasting stops there. Quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. And this is something that we haven't talked about at all on this webinar. And that's this concept of continual or continuous forecasting. Is, as you do your work, you are getting new data every day. Things are changing. As we talked about, maybe scope is changing. Maybe the team is changing. Maybe our understanding of the problem is changing. Maybe a global pandemic hits. Whatever. There's all kinds of stuff that is changing, that is affecting the data that is coming into your team. And so, as Julia mentioned again, I'll just keep quoting Julia. It is so cheap. To do these Monte Carlo simulations, it is so cheap that you should at the very least consider, when this new data comes in, consider how you might use that data. If not, update your forecast altogether, with this new data. So I call it your get out of jail free card for any Monopoly fans out there. It's your get out of jail free card. You're never just setting one forecast at the beginning of your project and like, okay, that's a plan. We got the plan. We got to work the plan because that's a plan and we made the plan, right? It's not that. It's continuous forecasting. Every day new data is coming in. We take that new data, we rerun the forecast, and decide how we might want to update the risks that we're communicating to our customers. So if you have no data, go find data. If you really, really don't have data, then try and get, work the project and try to get that data as quickly as possible. As we said, you only need, about 10 data points and you have a pretty good idea.
Exactly. Also, if this helps anyone, it's not a completely great metaphor because, and I'll explain why, but I like to think of it like a GPS. A GPS doesn't tell you all the multiple, well, it gives you a few options when you start with, but the part of the metaphor that does work for me is that when I turn it on, I get an initial forecast, but I don't just shut it off and say, okay, now I'm going. I leave it on. And as I move and as I experience different scenarios, it's constantly updating my forecast of when I can arrive, right? And so that's what, Dan was really talking about, is that's how we want to think about the forecast. This is not a one and done. This is a thing that you want to not constantly, you don't need to look at it every second, but figure out the right cadence for you to come back and check in on your forecast, because the whole point is this is so easy to do. It's fast to do. it can help you get ahead of those nasty surprises. It can help you have the conversations as early as possible. If stuff starts to veer in the wrong direction, you can have that corrective discussion much, much earlier than in other situations. So I think that's also the value of having a method of forecasting that is easy, quick, and cheap to do, because then you can do it more often, right? When it's expensive, you're not going to want to do it as often as that. I'm just wanting to check my time here. Okay, we have a few minutes left. So we have a lot of questions that we didn't get to answer. I'm going to go through some slides here, and I've got some other things that you could look at later. And we're going to take all of these questions and we're going to deduplicate them, and we're going to try to start answering these either in blogs or, quick videos or something like that. So please be on the lookout for that. We'll share it. We'll share these things in the app as much as possible. We will have the recording of this webinar. I will link it inside the app as well and say, if you missed it, here's the recording of the webinar. So you're able to share this with your colleagues. If you haven't, I know a lot of you are already using one or more of these apps. That's how you found out about this webinar. If you aren't using Actionable Agile Analytics or Portfolio Forecaster, you can try it for free. No strings attached. You can visit our website, get more details. If you're already a user and it's working out for you, leave us a review, especially on the Atlassian Marketplace. You can email us at support and give us, other reviews as well if you're on other platforms. There's a lot of awesome stuff that you can do. And I'm really interested in hearing stories from you all that are out in your different environments using these tools, because hearing the wins that you're getting, the challenges that you're facing, not only do they help me make a better tool to help you continue being successful, I learn a lot in the process. So I really want to hear your stories. So let us know. Dan, what would you like to let people know that you have coming up? This is sort of like after Hot Ones. This camera. Tell us what you've got going on.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to, we have a consulting arm of the Actionable Agile website. So if you go to consulting.actionableagile.com, you can see we have a bunch of classes coming up. You can see a classes. I think we've got those classes out, well into next year. So if you're interested in learning more about some of these, or about some of these topics, getting your specific questions answered, here, that's, please contact us there. You just want to have a chat. You want to talk about what you're doing. We'd love to hear from you as well. There's a Drunk Agile YouTube channel. Maybe some of you know about our YouTube channel called Drunk Agile, where we also get into a lot of these topics. And then last but not least, my latest book, which is Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability Volume 2. It's like second part in the series. I don't know how many are going to be in this part. I don't know. Not George Lucas. I haven't mapped out 9 to begin with, but that's out there on LeanPub. I just published that a few months ago. Got a lot of questions about when that's going to be on Amazon. As much as I hate giving Jeff Bezos any more money, it will be on Amazon sometime. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, early next year. There's some things that we're trying to do with like print layout and images and things like that. I want to make sure it's right before I put it in print, but just know it is available out there right now on LeanPub for anybody who wants to purchase that. But you'll see, we'll put updates here whenever I get that out on Amazon. We'll put that here. So I guess those are the things I had.
Yep. And I want to do one more sort of group shout out. So for those of you who may not be aware, we do have a 55 Degrees community, community.55degrees.se. It's a place that we're hoping to build a community of users so you can talk to each other and you don't always have to just hear from us. But the reason that I'm bringing it up right now is because Dan has some premium courses. In addition to our free intro to Actionable Agile, he does have courses about introduction to flow metrics for predictability, and scaling flow that highly correlate with what a lot of you are doing. So take a look at that. But with that, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. Our support team is always happy to talk to you and to help you get what you need to be successful. And we can't wait to see you at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.